The boardroom was silent, almost unnaturally so. A glass of water trembled in the hands of one executive, while another shifted uncomfortably in his chair. And then came the words, sharp, cutting, and unnecessary. Who invited her? The question hung in the air, heavy with condescension, privilege, and disbelief. Eyes darted toward her, as if the very presence of a black woman in that room was an anomaly, a disruption to a carefully orchestrated hierarchy. She didn't flinch, not outwardly, not yet. But inside something sparked, a combination of fire, focus, and unshakable resolve. She didn't know it at that moment, but a single action she would take in the next few days would set in motion a chain reaction powerful enough to shake the empire around her. Here's what that moment teaches us. Opportunity often arrives disguised as insult, and brilliance is rarely recognized until it acts. The room smelled of expensive coffee and polished wood, but underneath that veneer was a system designed to suppress, to silence, to maintain control. Every laugh, every sideways glance, every micro-gesture was a calculated reminder. You do not belong here. She could have reacted. She could have been visibly shaken, chastised, or defensive. Most would have, and many had in this company's history. But she did not. Instead, she absorbed. She calculated. She waited. The quiet patience in her gaze was not submission, it was strategy in its purest form. Minutes later, the meeting continued. Deals were discussed, numbers were thrown across screens, but the seed had been planted, a seed of transformation, of reckoning, and in the silence of that room, the protagonist of our story took her first invisible step toward an outcome no one saw coming. The question now is, how did she turn this moment of subtle humiliation into a decisive system-shattering victory? By the end of this story, you'll see how what looked like a mere insult became the ignition point for strategic brilliance, a demonstration that a single calculated choice can rewrite history. But before we get there, we need to understand who she is, where she came from, and why no one ever expected her to succeed. And that brings us to the beginning, the backstory that reveals why this moment, this tiny fracture in their empire, mattered more than anyone realized. She didn't arrive at that boardroom by accident. Every step had been deliberate, every sacrifice quietly endured. Born in a neighborhood where opportunities were scarce and expectations lower, she quickly learned that talent alone would not carry her forward. The world would test her patience, challenge her worth, and often treat brilliance as a threat rather than an asset. Her mother, a schoolteacher, had instilled a principle that would guide her life. You must know your value before anyone else does, and yet knowing her value wasn't enough. Every day she confronted microaggressions, systemic barriers, and the subtle machinery of exclusion, from being overlooked for promotions to being whispered about in corridors she was only just entering. By the time she earned her MBA from a top-tier business school, she had already mastered the art of observation. She learned to read rooms like books, to anticipate behaviors before they manifested, and to turn seeming disadvantages into hidden strengths. What most executives saw as hesitancy or deference, she recognized as the patience necessary for the right moment to strike. It wasn't just about her career, it was about a system that had repeatedly underestimated black excellence. She had seen colleagues, brilliant, driven, and ambitious, fall victim to bias, their potential minimized because of skin tone, gender, or a perceived lack of fit. Each instance left her with a sharper understanding. If she wanted to survive, she couldn't just play by their rules, she had to reshape the game entirely. Her early career was a crucible. She started in entry-level roles, often the only person who looked like her in the room. Meetings were arenas of subtle exclusion, her ideas dismissed, her insights rephrased by others, and her presence questioned. Who invited her was not a single isolated insult, it was a refrain that echoed across her professional life. But it was also in these moments that she discovered something most never see. Adversity is a mirror, revealing hidden power and resilience. Each slight, each rebuff, honed her strategic instincts. She became meticulous, documenting patterns, predicting moves, and learning to wait for the exact moment when leverage could be seized. She didn't just want to succeed, she wanted to change the rules of the room, to demonstrate that intellect, discipline, and moral courage could not be constrained by prejudice. And yet, despite all her preparation, nothing could have fully prepared her for the moral dilemma that awaited, the point at which doing the right thing and winning the game would seem mutually exclusive. Here's the quiet truth. The roots of her eventual triumph were planted in years of careful observation, disciplined patience, and an unshakable belief in her own worth. The system had tried to define her limits, but she had already begun sketching the blueprint for breaking them. By understanding this backstory, we see the stakes more clearly. This was never just a boardroom insult, it was a microcosm of an entire empire built on exclusion, and she was about to challenge it from the inside. And that leads us directly to the moral fork in the road. The moment where she could either conform to expectation or rise. in quiet but irreversible brilliance, to a destiny no one saw coming. The meeting had ended, but the echoes of who invited her lingered like smoke in the air. She walked down the hallway, heels clicking against polished floors, each step measured, deliberate, a rhythm of silent calculation. Colleagues whispered behind her back. Some laughed nervously, others looked on with veiled curiosity, unsure if she would react, crumble or disappear. Here's what most people fail to understand about moments like this: it's not the insult itself, but what you do in the seconds, hours or days that follow that defines your trajectory. She paused outside a glass-walled office, staring at her reflection. She saw the weight of every slight she had endured, every opportunity denied, every whispered dismissal, and in that reflection, she confronted the moral fork in the road. Option 1 was obvious: play safe, conform, smile politely in future meetings, accept the system as it was, keep climbing, step by cautious step, never exposing the full measure of her talent. Many would have taken this path. It offered security, safety, and the illusion of progress. Option 2 was invisible to most. It demanded courage, strategy, and patience to rise, not by defiance, but by orchestrated brilliance, to confront injustice not with anger, but with a methodical, undeniable reversal of power. The tension was almost unbearable. The first option promised temporary peace, but long-term invisibility. The second option promised exposure, risk, and scrutiny, yet it carried the potential to transform the room, the company, and perhaps even the system itself. She didn't yet act. She didn't speak. But internally, a calculation was taking shape. She considered the behavioral patterns of the executives, the psychological biases that kept them blind to threats from those they underestimated. She recognized their overconfidence, their reliance on status quo assumptions, and their inability to anticipate a quiet, disciplined mind operating outside the rules they controlled. She remembered a lesson from her mentor, a seasoned strategist who had once said, "Power doesn't set, always roar. Sometimes it waits silently, invisible until the moment it becomes undeniable." And then it clicked. This wasn't just about her career, it was about demonstrating to herself and everyone watching that intelligence, preparation, and moral courage could not be dismissed. A single action, if chosen wisely, could flip the entire outcome. In that instant, she made her decision. She would not react impulsively. She would not seek petty revenge. Instead, she would craft a plan, move in silence, and let the eventual reversal speak louder than any words. What she didn't know yet was how deeply this choice would test her patience, her intellect, and her resilience. She would face systemic obstacles, public humiliation, and moments that seemed impossible to overcome. But for now, the fork had been chosen. She had opted for the path of strategic brilliance. The question now becomes: what hidden power, intelligence, or skill did she possess that would allow her to transform insult into influence? She returned to her desk, settling into a chair that felt both familiar and foreign. The noise of the office buzzed around her, yet she was completely focused. Her mind operating like a chessboard, each move anticipated, each outcome calculated. Here's what others had missed. She had been preparing for this moment long before it ever arrived. Every project she had led, every negotiation she had navigated, every subtle observation of human behavior had been quietly building a foundation of invisible power, and now, that foundation would become her advantage. She wasn't just smart, she was strategic. She understood cognitive bias, social psychology, and the mechanics of influence. She knew which colleagues overestimated their own intuition, and which underestimated her competence. She had an innate sense of timing: when to speak, when to remain silent, and when a small quiet action could trigger a disproportionate ripple effect. For weeks she had studied the inner workings of the company, the alliances and vulnerabilities of key decision-makers, the hidden dependencies that allowed the empire to function. To an outsider, it might look like she was observing passively, but in truth she was mapping the battlefield, invisible lines of influence, pressure points, and levers of power that no one else had noticed. She pulled up old reports, emails, and meeting notes. Patterns emerged: inconsistent priorities, unaddressed inefficiencies, and subtle but damaging blind spots in leadership. Every weakness became a potential pivot point. Every overlooked detail was a lever she could eventually pull. And then there was her network, a carefully nurtured circle of allies, mentors and advisors, who operated beyond the view of the boardroom. They weren't loud, they weren't flashy, and most people assumed their influence was minimal. But she knew differently. This was a hidden ecosystem of support, knowledge, and leverage that could amplify her actions when the time was right. Here's what's remarkable. True power is often invisible until it manifests with precision. In the quiet of her office, she wasn't just planning her next steps, she was quietly rewriting the rules of engagement, preparing for a reversal that would feel sudden and impossible to those who had underestimated her. A single action, a carefully orchestrated initiative, could cascade into an outcome no one saw coming, and though she didn't act yet, the first small reversals of power had already begun. Subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in influence were quietly setting the stage. She didn't need immediate recognition. She didn't need applause. Her victories at this stage were silent, deliberate. And that's the thing about real strategy. It works long before anyone notices it is happening. But just as her hidden power began to grow, the world outside her office remained a force of pressure and unpredictability. The system she was about to challenge would push back with everything it had. Weeks of careful observation and silent strategy had positioned her perfectly, or so she thought. The company, with its polished exterior and confident executives, had a way of revealing hidden fault lines when least expected, and soon, she would face a moment that tested not only her intellect but her resolve. It started subtly. A project she had championed was reassigned without explanation. An initiative she had meticulously designed was publicly questioned in a high-stakes meeting. Comments, once casual, now carried veiled condescension. And then came the tipping point. A presentation meant to showcase her vision became a stage for humiliation. Executives interrupted, dismissed her insights, and in one pointed moment, a senior leader questioned her competence in front of the entire team. The sting of those words, delivered with authority and expectation, reverberated through the room. The subtle machinery of bias had shifted into overt attack. She didn't collapse. She didn't raise her voice. But inside a storm was brewing. The system had revealed its teeth, showing her just how entrenched its power truly was. Here's the critical insight. The higher the potential, the greater the resistance. Every obstacle she faced wasn't just chance. It was the system defending itself against disruption. After the meeting, whispers followed her. Colleagues questioned if she could handle the pressure. The media, internal and external, latched onto minor missteps, framing them as proof of incompetence. She had become the target of a narrative she had not yet chosen to fight openly. In these moments, doubt could have consumed her. Many would have yielded, accepting that the system was too powerful to challenge. But she had already internalized a key principle. Failure is not the absence of progress, but the early phase of transformation. She retreated briefly, not in defeat, but in calculation. She dissected every failure, mapped every public breakdown, and considered the psychological levers she could exploit. What the world saw as a collapse, she recognized as a crucible, the precise conditions needed to test and refine her strategy. Here's the subtle genius. True resilience is not reactive, but anticipatory. Every humiliation became data. Every obstacle became a building block for a comeback so meticulously planned that when it finally arrived, it would appear effortless. And in that quiet space a spark ignited. She realized that public embarrassment wasn't a wall, it was a pivot point. She could either be crushed under the weight of the system, or she could leverage it to create a reversal that no one would see coming. This realization marked the moment where transformation truly began. The setback wasn't the end, it was the beginning of the next phase, the turning point, the spark that would reshape her approach and ignite the comeback. The humiliation lingered like a shadow, but she refused to let it define her. Alone in her office, she reviewed the past weeks, with meticulous precision. Every misstep, every snide remark, every slight, she cataloged it all. And then, amid the quiet, she had a revelation. A mentor, an industry veteran she trusted, had once said, "Sometimes to defeat a system, you must learn its rhythm, not fight its force." She realized now that the boardroom was a living organism, a network of egos, blind spots and assumptions. It could be anticipated, influenced, and ultimately redirected. She didn't need to confront them directly. She needed a plan so precise, so calculated, that the system would expose its own weaknesses. She began sketching a blueprint for influence, small, silent actions that would compound, turning perception, power, and loyalty to her advantage. It was also a mindset shift. She understood that the comeback would not be instantaneous. Silent victories, delayed payoff, and patient execution would carry her further than visible defiance. Each minor triumph, unnoticed by the world, was a brick in the foundation of a larger reversal. She began leveraging her hidden network, quietly aligning allies who understood her vision. She gathered data, insights, and leverage points, transforming what had seemed like setbacks into opportunities. Each failure, each public embarrassment became a lesson, a way to anticipate the moves of those who underestimated her. And then came the final spark. She identified a vulnerability in the very empire that had tried to dismiss her, a financial inefficiency, a strategic oversight, a dependency that, if exposed at the right moment, could trigger a cascade of change. The revelation was not obvious to anyone else, but to her, it was a roadmap to strategic reversal. Here's the insight. The turning point isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, almost invisible, but its consequences are seismic. In that moment, she didn't just plan a comeback. She set the stage to transform the entire system that had doubted her. She left the office that night with a calm certainty. The tables were not yet turned, the victory not yet claimed, but the path was clear. A single action, executed with patience and precision, could rewrite the narrative completely. The stage was set, the plan was in motion, and the world, still blind to her strategy, was about to experience a shift they never anticipated. The following weeks were almost invisible to the world outside her office. Meetings continued, deals were made, and the boardroom carried on as if nothing had shifted, but behind the scenes she was moving with deliberate, surgical precision. She started small, subtle communications with key allies, adjustments to projects that seemed minor, but had cascading effects. Every action was measured, every conversation a potential lever for influence. She knew the value of patience. A single misstep could expose her strategy too early. What was remarkable to observe was her quiet confidence. She didn't seek validation, applause, or recognition. Instead, she focused on results, on the compounding power of small victories. A contract subtly redirected to favor her department. A reporting structure shifted to grant her insight into critical operations. A colleague quietly persuaded to support her vision. Each move was invisible, yet each brought her closer to tipping the balance. Here's the crucial point. True strategic execution often looks like stillness to the untrained eye. While others floundered in visible displays of ambition, she was building an unseen momentum that, when unleashed, would feel inevitable. She also leveraged psychological insight. She understood how egos reacted, how confidence could be manipulated, and where the blind spots lay in a room full of powerful individuals. A single suggestion here, a well-timed insight there, and she was subtly rewriting perceptions without anyone realizing it. By now, she had also begun documenting every detail, not out of paranoia, but out of precision. She knew that when the moment of public reversal came, she would need irrefutable evidence of her plan's validity, and proof that the system had already failed to anticipate her moves. Colleagues noticed subtle changes, projects improving inexplicably, efficiency creeping up, overlooked vulnerabilities beginning to stabilize. Yet no one connected these small successes to her. The quiet climb, the invisible hand, was unnoticed, exactly as she intended. She didn't celebrate, she didn't announce progress, she simply advanced. Each silent step added weight to her eventual leap, making the upcoming reversal not just dramatic, but undeniable. And then the first signs appeared. Cracks in the system she had targeted began to show. A miscalculation by an executive here, a minor operational failure there, seemingly random, yet perfectly aligned with her strategy. The stage was almost ready. The suspense, the anticipation, the tension, everything was aligned for the moment that would expose her brilliance in full view. The public reversal, the climax of this entire silent climb, was about to arrive. The boardroom was packed. Investors, executives, and stakeholders had gathered for what was supposed to be a routine quarterly review. The room hummed with confident chatter, the same arrogance, the same underestimation that had followed her for years. She entered calmly, her presence quiet, but commanding. Nothing in her demeanor suggested the storm that had been brewing for months. And that was the genius of her strategy. The most formidable power is often the least conspicuous until it strikes. Her presentation began. Graphs, data, and insights unfolded with precision. Every inefficiency, oversight, and vulnerability of the company's leadership was subtly exposed, not through accusation, but through indisputable evidence. Contracts mismanaged, dependencies ignored, opportunities lost, all laid bare. Eyes widened, whispered gasps, executives exchanged glances they had never expected. The very system that had sought to diminish her was unraveling in real time, and she didn't have to raise her voice. A single, deliberate revelation after another built a narrative of undeniable competence and insight. A single action, the presentation of a strategic realignment plan, flipped the room. Investors began nodding, allies aligned. Even her detractors were forced to acknowledge the oversight they had ignored for so long. She didn't just win, she transformed the system that had tried to exclude her. Here's what that moment teaches us. True power isn't loud, and victory isn't revenge. It's the orchestration of patience, intellect, and timing to create outcomes that feel inevitable in hindsight. By the end of that day, the empire that had doubted her was no longer the same. Executives who had dismissed her were humbled, and the rules of engagement had been rewritten. She didn't gloat, she simply moved forward, leaving the lesson clear. Excellence and strategy cannot be ignored, ever. The dust had settled, but the echoes of the reversal lingered. The boardroom that had once been a stage for exclusion now functioned differently, subtly, irrevocably transformed. Executives who had underestimated her now operated under the undeniable truth: brilliance cannot be silenced by arrogance or bias. The CEO who had sneered, asking who invited her, was reassigned to a quieter, less influential role. The empire's facade of invincibility had cracked, revealing vulnerabilities that had long been ignored. The system itself, its culture, its blind spots, its hierarchy of entitlement, was forced to adapt or collapse. Yet, the story wasn't just about punishment or exposure, there was redemption, too. Colleagues who had previously doubted her saw the cost of underestimation, allies who had hesitated were inspired, the company began embracing merit over privilege, evidence over ego, and results over appearances. Her victory became a template for systemic change, not just personal triumph. For her the cost had been significant: sleepless nights, emotional strain, and constant vigilance, but the reward was profound. She had not only reclaimed her authority, she had transformed the very environment that had tried to suppress her. The subtle lesson here is that resilience, patience, and moral clarity often carry a price, but the impact reverberates far beyond personal gain. And yet, perhaps the most important ripple was unseen. Young professionals, especially women of color navigating similar spaces, began to hear her story. They realized that a single act of strategic brilliance, executed with patience, intelligence, and moral weight, could challenge entire systems of exclusion. She became a quiet emblem of possibility, proof that intellect and integrity could bend outcomes toward justice. Here's what that teaches us. Success isn't just about winning, it's about reshaping the ecosystem so that fairness, clarity, and excellence can thrive. The aftermath is rarely a tidy celebration. It's reflection, recalibration, and recognition that every victory carries lessons for the future. With the system transformed, and the ripples of change spreading, the final question becomes: what legacy does she leave, and how can her story inspire others to act with courage and strategy? Years later, the memory of that boardroom incident remained vivid, not because of the insult, but because of what followed. Who invited her had become more than a question. It was a catalyst, a moment that revealed the fragility of a system built on exclusion and arrogance. She had moved on, but the lessons endured. The company she transformed operated differently. Merit, insight, and strategic thinking were finally respected over entitlement. Those who had once doubted her found their assumptions challenged, their egos tempered, and their approach forever altered. Her legacy was not just the public victories, it was the invisible shifts she had orchestrated, the careers she inspired, the minds she opened, and the courage she ignited in those watching quietly from the margins. True leadership, she had demonstrated, is not about being seen, it's about creating change that lasts beyond applause. Here's the lesson for anyone watching. Moments of exclusion, insult, or challenge are not endpoints, they are invitations to observe, strategize, and act with integrity. A single action, thoughtfully executed, can ripple outward, reshaping not only your path but the environment around you. She didn't just survive the insult, she transformed it into a masterclass of strategy, patience, and moral courage. And that is the takeaway for all of us. Quiet mastery, relentless preparation, and moral clarity are more powerful than any loud confrontation. So, reflect on this when faced with your own "who invited her" moment, the moment that questions your place, your value, or your potential. What will you do? Will you react impulsively, or will you observe, plan, and execute with precision? The story doesn't end here. It continues in the actions you take, the systems you challenge, and the legacy you leave. And if this narrative resonates with your values, your strategy, or your vision for change, let it inspire your next step. Like, comment, and subscribe if you believe in the power of patience, intellect, and moral courage to transform not just individual lives, but entire systems. And remember, brilliance is never an accident. It's prepared for, executed with precision, and revealed at exactly the right moment.